Professor John Hedley-Brooke. As you see, he's been Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford. He also was Director of the Ian Ramsay Centre at Oxford up till 2006. He's now also an Emeritus Fellow, still at Oxford, but also at Lancaster University. I think you live in the Lake District now, don't you? Which I can see the attractions of being an honorary professor at Lancaster University. But he's also had a big experience in the science and religion arena. You'll see some of his books listed on the CV, and there's some, I think, on the bookstall as well. And he was editor of the British Journal for the History of Science and president of that same society for the History of Science. And he also serves in lots of other initiatives for science and religion, including the most recently the International Society for Science and Religion. And he is going to be one of the foundation fellows of the Institute for Advanced Study, or already are, I guess, at Durham. Yeah. So it's a great pleasure to have you to talk about the reception of Darwin's theory. He knows a lot about this subject, so we're looking forward to it. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Bob, and good morning, everybody. After such a very generous build-up, there is only one way you can go. There's a long way to fall. And I thought I'd just begin, actually, if this works, by showing you something that did fall. A building in the South American city of Concepcion. Charles Darwin, on his voyage round the world, experienced an earthquake. And this was the cathedral in ruins, the greatest pile of ruins I have ever seen. And I think for some people that visual image might almost symbolize what comes to mind when we think of Darwin's impact on the religious world. I was listening to Richard Dawkins at the Cambridge Darwin Festival this last week, and his way of putting it before a very large audience was that Darwin left concepts of God in tatters. Well, there you see sort of stones in tatters. It actually encouraged Darwin to think of something rather interesting, which was, had England in its history been subject to earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, perhaps England would have never been quite the happy place that Cambridge is today, and indeed was when Darwin studied here early in his life. On that theme of posing a challenge to traditional religious belief, Sigmund Freud once said there had been 3 great revolutions in the history of Western thought. The first was the Copernican revolution, when humankind was dislodged from the physical center of the universe. The second revolution was that precipitated by Darwin, by showing that human beings are not so distinct from the rest of the animal creation, a humbling experience in another sense. And the third great revolution, you'll be surprised to learn, was that of Freud, who wanted to say that we are no longer in control even of our own minds, because it's the unconscious mind that is doing so much work hidden from view. Darwin himself had something to say about this decentering. He says, man may see himself as worthy the attention of a creator, but it is more accurate and more humble to see the continuity between animals and ourselves. So there's no point trying to pretend that Darwin's work did not have major implications for religious belief. And this was often made the basis of humour and satire in the Victorian period. For example, apes at the London Zoo allegedly asked themselves, "Am I my keeper's brother?" Darwin himself came very close to saying the following: "Those who oppose my theory by snarling and baring their teeth only confirm their canine origins." Now, according to legend, the Darwinians had a good line in putting down or sending up bishops. And many of you, I think, will have heard of the famous story relates to a meeting of the British Association in Oxford in 1860, when the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, supposedly decided to taunt the Darwinians by asking Thomas Henry Huxley whether he preferred to think of himself descended from an ape on his grandfather's side or his grandmother's side. And according to the legend, Huxley started rubbing his hands with glee and then whispered to a neighbour, "The Lord hath delivered him into mine hands." And his retort was that he would rather have an ape for an ancestor, well, the story says, than a bishop. And it's actually correct in a sense, because what Huxley said, he'd rather have an ape for an ancestor than be associated with a man who used his dignity and authority to obscure the truth, and everybody knew to whom he was referring. Now, stories of this kind dominate discussion about the early reception of Darwin's theory, and the implication is that there were really only two positions. You were either for Darwin or you were against. Perhaps that's crystallized nicely in the story of a speech that Disraeli gave in Oxford shortly after the publication of Darwin's work. And he said, "It seems, gentlemen," because there were only gentlemen in the audience, "it seems, gentlemen, that we are either on the side of the apes or on the side of the angels. As for me, I am on the side of the angels." And the next day, in the popular press, Disraeli's speech was captured in that rather nice image. I love showing that to my students in Oxford because it gives an indication of what they might wear to an Oxford ball. So again, it would, I think, be bizarre to suggest that Darwin's theory was not a profoundly disturbing revelation. For those who were losing their faith, for whatever reason, Darwin's theory could be the last straw. And it was, of course, rejected many times by those who found it intolerable, and there are many who reject it today. There were fears for the stability of society if men and women were encouraged to behave like animals, and that was a very significant concern. And satirical cartoons used to cash in on the prospects for the animals. This is one of my favourite little cartoons of the period. One monkey saying to the other, "Cut my tail off quick, Tim. I can't wait to take my proper station in society." Well, in this talk, I don't want to minimise the cultural significance of Darwin's work, which, as I say, remains of the highest import today. In taking a long-term perspective, it seems to me that at least three major shifts can be associated with what we still call the Darwinian revolution. If we associate these shifts with Darwin alone, we would be making a mistake. And I'm afraid in this bicentenary year, this mistake has been made many times. Darwin is lifted completely out of context to argue for all kinds of things. But there is no doubt Darwin's theory was more than merely a symbol of these shifts. It helped to forge a new vocabulary for discussing the appearance of design and adaptation in nature. So the first shift I just want to refer you to is what we might call a breakdown of the consensus in how science and religion should be related. Prior to Darwin, there was a long tradition of natural theology, particularly in the English-speaking world, in which one argued from nature to nature's God, from the beauty, the order, the intelligibility, the apparent design in nature. One constructed an image of a beneficent God who had made everything in love, power, and wisdom. After Darwin, you begin to detect a breakdown of that consensus. And I'd just like to mention very briefly four figures. They all illustrate a rather different reaction to Darwin. And, as I say, the breakdown of that consensus. Now, here is the first one, the Reverend Baden-Powell, who was actually a professor of mathematics in the University of Oxford. And Powell, rather ahead of his time in some ways, argued that science and religion had different spheres of authority, that the one, properly understood, did not really impinge on the other. science was about the establishment of laws and facts in nature. Religion had the authority in the moral sphere. And I like to mention Powell because that argument has been resuscitated relatively recently by the late Stephen Jay Gould in a well-known little book called Rocks of Ages, and the arguments are almost identical. So that was one possible reaction to Darwin, that the church had nothing to fear from science, because science simply operated in a different magisterium, in a different sphere. Now, my second figure is Presbyterian Christian Charles Hodge, taught at Princeton, and he does reject Darwin's theory. But he's worth mentioning because his attitude was a little different from what one might expect. Hodge did not object to the idea of evolution itself, nor did he believe that the Bible ruled out the possibility of creation through natural causes. But what Hodge did find very difficult was Darwin's mechanism of natural selection, which seemed to require random processes occurring in nature, nature itself presented as mindless and without intention. So Hodge is saying Darwinism is effectively atheistic, though the idea of evolution need not be. Well, at Princeton there was another reaction from James McCosh, an eventual president. I've shown that slide because it shows McCosh on what became known as McCosh's walk. McCosh became a very positive advocate of theistic evolution. He was in the same Calvinist tradition as Hodge, but he saw no problem with the existence of chance in the evolutionary process. As he put it, the role of accident cannot be accidental. There is a sense in which chance and accident were creative forces within evolution itself. Well, my fourth example is something even stronger. This is Asa Gray. He was responsible very largely for popularizing Darwin's work and his theory of natural selection in particular in North America. Darwin was a great friend to Gray. Their correspondence makes fascinating reading. And there are several reasons, I think, why Gray was drawn to Darwin's theory. In the first place, he appreciated the sheer quality of Darwin's science. He didn't dismiss it on religious grounds, which so many contemporary commentators did. But I think Gray was drawn to Darwin's theory for other reasons. He felt that it might actually help the theologians with their problem of suffering, because natural selection, in a sense, put the spotlight on the problem of suffering and pain in the world. What Gray was able to argue is that if the struggle for survival, if the competition for limited resources is a precondition of the very possibility of the emergence of human beings, then pain and suffering in the world may simply be the price we have to pay, the price that the animal creation has paid as well, for the possibility of some kind of progressive process leading to morally responsible human beings. There is actually another very interesting reason why Gray was drawn to Darwin, and we might come back to this later. The Darwinian theory actually presents a very unified view of creation. All living things ultimately have their origin in the same primitive form. Darwin and other of his contemporaries were very heavily against slavery, and it's very recently been argued in a new book called Darwin's Sacred Cause by James Moore and Adrian Desmond, that the image of branching human races from a single proto-human being actually provided an intellectual resource for challenging the notion that there were separate human races. And of course, if you believed there were separate human races, then that could provide a justification for slavery. Darwin is viciously anti-slavery. It's one of his most endearing liberal traits. Now, of course, you could argue that there had never actually been a consensus before on how science and religion should be interpreted and constructed in terms of the relationship between them. But I do think the Darwinian impact did have an effect in breaking down popular paradigms of the way in which science and religion should be brought together. So that was my first of 3 points concerning the overall impact of Darwin's work. The second relates to it, and that's the spelling out by Darwin of the continuities between humans and animals. And there is no doubt this actually involved an often painful process of readjustment. Now, it's not so much a problem for Darwin himself, because he tends to elevate animals rather than denigrate human beings. He has a dog whose behavior he describes as almost religious. He has a dog which is capable of the most interesting forms of reasoning. And I don't want to go into this, but it just illustrates the point that what Darwin is seeing is an elevation of animal qualities as part of his rhetorical strategy for placing us within nature rather than above nature. So it's not so much a problem for Darwin, but it was for many of his contemporaries, including some of the most eminent scientific associates. For example, his mentor in geology, Charles Lyell, found it very difficult to accept that the human mind was the product of natural selection alone. And even the co-founder of the theory of natural selection, Alfred Russel Wallace, argued that the human mind could not be explained simply as the product of natural processes working through a process of selection. Wallace, incidentally, became very interested in phenomena associated with spiritualism and rather dismayed Darwin as a consequence of that. For Darwin, the very enterprise of arguing about God's existence and attributes was a sign of human arrogance and self-centeredness, the point I've made before. And that attitude did spill over into some, if not all, late Victorian agnosticism. Those who spoke for the Christian churches were sometimes prepared to weaken their grip on their anthropocentric beliefs in face of natural disasters, such as another earthquake, one which hit southern Italy in 1908. It seemed necessary to give up what the modernist Jesuit priest George Tyrrell described, and I quote here, as our confident assurance that the whole creation centers around a chance page of human history that has escaped the moth and mildew of time. Very interesting comment on how we do interpret the world as rotating or revolving around ourselves. And Darwin's work was a major contribution to that process of decentering. So I do underline that again. The third point I wanted to make is that by the end of the 19th century, it was extremely rare to find in any scientific text references to divine design, divine direction, or divine control. I especially emphasize no reference to the divine in technical scientific texts. God doesn't disappear from works of science popularization, and he most certainly doesn't in the literature of today, as you well know. But we're talking here about technical science, and I think you have to say that Darwin contributed to, he was not uniquely responsible for it, Darwin contributed to a movement in 19th century natural philosophy in which a principle of what we now call methodological naturalism became extremely important. That if you wanted to understand natural phenomena, the one thing you didn't do was import God as part of your explanation. So it's difficult to deny, I think, that evolutionary theory was instrumental in achieving that silence about divine activity in the context of technical science. Peter Bowler, a fine historian of science, has observed that although Darwin's mechanism of natural selection was in a fair amount of trouble by the end of the 19th century, the theoretical alternatives under discussion had all the appearance of being secular and completely naturalistic. So that's the third of my three very general points about the cultural impact of Darwin. I now want to switch to the second section of my talk and just give you a few nuances, a few cautionary tales, or perhaps a few explosions of common myths, because myths abound in the discussion of science and religion. Actually, that prompts me to mention a brand new book which has only just come out this year, Harvard University Press. It's edited by my good friend Ronald Numbers. It's called Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths About Science and Religion. And there are 25 myths in the book, just the thing for bedtime reading, because each one is only 3,000 words long. And it contains an expose of most of the really common misperceptions of the relations between science and religion, some historical, some contemporary. So that's a little plug for a book that I think you would find useful, and those of you who teach courses in science and religion, your students, I think, would absolutely love that. Okay, so we need to expose a few myths. Well, one of the favourite ones is that Wilberforce Huxley one that I mentioned right at the beginning of the talk. So let's just for a moment have a closer look at this. I wanted to show you that particular slide because it indicates the way in which there was a transformation in the social process of science during the 19th century. What I mean by a social transformation is that early in the century, many of the practitioners of science in England would have been clergymen, or who would have had some association with the church. And so they were depicted in Punch there as a group of kind of geological amateurs. You can see they've all got their hammers, but they're wearing their top hats. The professor of geology here in Cambridge, Adam Sedgwick, apparently used to go out on Sundays sometimes geologizing, and that could cause ructions in some parts of the church. So it was said of Sedgwick that he hid his hammer up his sleeve for fear of offending Scotchmen. But the point here is that we've got a clergyman doing geology. It's actually Sedgwick who gave some of the most crucial geological information to the young Darwin when he was studying here in Cambridge. Now, the point I want to make is by the end of the 19th century, science has become a professional activity. So this is a very crude generalization, but early 19th century, much of the science is done by what we would call amateurs. By the end of the 19th century, it's done by professionals. And one of the attractions of Darwin's science for some of the scientific fraternity was that it gave a kind of intellectual underpinning for the establishment of rigorous standards in science, which had the effect of excluding the clergy. It had the effect of excluding the clergy from the practice of science. And there are very interesting statistics on that, which I haven't time to go in for now. Well, the clash between Wilberforce and Huxley, in a sense, was about that, because Wilberforce, of course, was a clergyman. He knew a lot of natural history. There he is, caricatured as Soapy Sam Wilberforce, his saponaceous character, rather an oily rhetorician by all accounts. And here is his combatant, Thomas Henry Huxley. The version of the story I gave you is almost certainly a myth, and it's a myth in two different senses. It's a myth because it was a foundation myth for that professional science that I've just been talking about. And when this anecdote is repeated, it's very often in the context of scientists luxuriating in the fact that a clergyman got his comeuppance. Religion should not interfere with science. So this story is a myth in that sense, a foundation myth of professional science. But it's also a myth in a second sense, the more common sense, of being largely false. It's the sort of story you would have to invent, even if it were not actually there. And a certain amount of invention, I think, did take place. Huxley did not defeat the bishop in some great debate, as it has been called. Contemporary reports actually suggest that the bishop reinforced the beliefs of those who were on his side, and Huxley succeeded in reinforcing the beliefs of those who were on his side. But the notion that there was some victory for science over religion is a complete nonsense. In fact, even Leonard Huxley, Thomas Huxley's son, in the edition of the Life and Letters of his father, makes it absolutely clear that there was no victory on Huxley's part. The majority of the audience, he says, would have sided with the bishop. We even know that there was one convert to Darwin who was converted back again on witnessing the debate. This was a naturalist called Henry Baker Tristram, who had already been applying the concept of natural selection to the study of larks and other birds in the Sahara Desert, but apparently on witnessing the debate got so irate with the Darwinians that he decided to change sides yet again. So the story, you see, doesn't really capture all the truth. It misses also another critical point, which is that Wilberforce was not necessarily typical of the Anglican commentators on evolution at the time. And I stress this point because a sermon was preached in Oxford in 1860 at the end of that British Association meeting, in which the man who preached clearly made room for the expansion of scientific naturalism and argued that the more we know of the laws of physical nature, the more that encourages to believe that there are also moral laws. This was Frederick Temple, and a few years later he became Archbishop of Canterbury, symbolizing actually the acceptance of evolution by the English Church. And as many of you know, Darwin himself was buried in Westminster Abbey. He was honoured as a great man of science, and at the time of the funeral in 1882, most of the religious commentary suggests that it is now widely accepted that Darwin's theory poses no serious threat to religious faith. Now that's 1882, at the time that Darwin died. Now I'd just like to mention one other thing before we leave the Wilberforce-Huxley debate. I was, as I mentioned earlier, privileged to take part last week in the big Darwin Festival here in Cambridge, and one of the speakers was Lord Robert May, a former president of the Royal Society. And at the conference dinner on Thursday evening, he made a very interesting point. And he said that at the time Darwin published his theory, it was by no means watertight. Well, Darwin, of course, knew that himself. There were many, many issues still to be resolved. But Robert May was so struck by, as it were, the inadequacies of the theory at that point in time, that he said if only Samuel Wilberforce had done his homework and actually studied the science of the day, he would have been able to give Darwin a really rough time. Well, what Lord Robert May appeared not to know was that Wilberforce did do his homework, and he did give Darwin a rough time, because he published a review of The Origin of Species in the Quarterly Review. It's about a 50-page review, and 40 of those 50 pages, if not more, are devoted to philosophical and scientific objections to Darwin's theory. The theology is there, but Wilberforce knew what he was doing. And Darwin himself, interestingly, says, "The bishop quizzes me quite splendidly." So, end of that myth. But there are a few more we need to look at. With the privilege of hindsight, it's tempting to suppose that theologians and churchmen were forced into making a response as soon as Darwin's theory appeared. Now, we know many did speak out, both for and against, but there are at least three reasons why that was not always the case. And I think these three reasons are quite interesting because they apply to other examples where science impinges on a kind of normative background. Some commentators, wisely we might think, adopted what we might call the wait and see strategy. Let's not condemn the theory outright, but let's not accept it either, because there are many, many issues to be resolved. Let's wait and see. And that has often been a reaction of religious communities to apparently damaging science. The presupposition is that in the long run there will still be harmony. The book of God's word and the book of God's works must in the end agree. So let's not be too hasty in dealing with this issue. That was quite a common reaction. Another issue worth, I think, mentioning is that many churchmen were preoccupied with other more pressing issues. So, for example, in England here, hard on the heels of the publication of The Origin of Species, there appeared a book called Essays and Reviews. Some of the contributors to that book were Anglican clergy. And they argued, drawing on biblical criticism coming out of Germany, that the Bible should be read like any other book. In other words, its authors were human, they themselves were products of the time in which they lived. Now, they argued that doesn't detract from the inspiration of Scripture, which can be the Word of God to those who study it. But the emphasis fell on reading the Bible like any other book. Now, if you were to read Samuel Wilberforce's review of Essays and Reviews and compare that with his review of Darwin's Origin of Species, you will see which of those two books caused him the most trouble. It was Essays and Reviews. The thought that Oxford dons, clergymen too, should be saying things like that about the Bible was absolutely anathema to Wilberforce. And Frederick Temple, who I mentioned earlier, was a contributor to that book, and Wilberforce was splenetic because he had actually ordained Temple. You can see all kinds of little political wheels within wheels in this particular issue. Because of resistance among several leading scientific authorities, there was also a sense in which the issues did not yet have to be taken too seriously. For example, in America, Louis Agassiz was a vehement opponent of Darwin's theory, and he's one of the great scientists of the age. Here in England, Richard Owen defended a more traditional understanding of creation. And it's interesting that Wilberforce cited Owen, and indeed Lyell, to buttress his case that the best science of the day was far superior to anything that Darwin had done. Now, I think he was wrong, but you can see the force of that kind of rhetoric. So the conclusion that historians have drawn, looking at these debates, is that it's not until about 1874 or 1875, 16 years after the publication of The Origin, it's not till about then that it became clear the tide was turning in favour of the Darwinians And after that date, really the theory could not be ignored by the churches. So that was the second of my cautionary tales. Here's a third. The fact that it was possible for a while at least to brush the Darwinian threat to one side is thrown into relief by the fact that other threats arising from the human sciences were less easily disposed of. Both in France and among Catholics in America, the danger from the doctrine of polygenism, that's the notion of independent origins for the different human races, that danger was often perceived as immediate and one that had to be answered. If there's only one human race, then the story is in harmony with the biblical narrative. But if there are more than one human race, then the Genesis creation narrative is jeopardized in ways that struck at the most fundamental doctrines, such as those of original sin in all human beings, and of course the redemptive work of Jesus Christ. Writing in 1859, that's the year of Darwin's publication, one American Catholic, Augustine Hewitt, declared that the plurality of the human race is the only scientific theory advocated by men of eminence that is in direct contravention to Catholic dogma. The better known Catholic anti-evolutionist Orestes Brownson made the point with equal fervour. He writes, original sin, the incarnation, redemption, regeneration, indeed all that has hitherto been regarded as distinctively Christian, would have no meaning if the unity of the human race were not a truth. Now this takes me back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, because according to a recent study of Catholic responses to Darwin, that greater concern over polygenism remained in place for many years. And the irony is, and this is why I suggest there's an important correction, the irony is that Darwin, Alfred Russel Wallace, Asa Gray, all contribute arguments from evolution for the rejection of polygenism. And as I was suggesting earlier, this does seem to have been in part linked to their hatred of slavery. Here's another cautionary tale. I'm keeping my eye on the clock. It's sometimes been said that when theologians accepted the case for evolution, their attempts at some kind of theistic evolution were largely worthless, because they failed to grasp the full significance of Darwin's theory, especially its emphasis on natural selection. And it is perfectly true that there were a good many half-baked schemes around. I say that with some feeling because Darwin repeatedly made this comment, that unless you have been staggered by my theory, you have not understood it. Unless you've been staggered by the realization of what a high proportion of God's creatures have perished in the long, tortuous, blood-stained trail of evolution. Unless you've been staggered, you have not understood my theory. So I hope at the end of this morning you will at least have been staggered. Darwin's vision is a compelling and utterly different one from that of the Cambridge theologian here, William Paley, who wrote, "It is a happy world after all." For Darwin, it's not such a happy prospect. Now, I stress that because, as I say, some of the commentators on evolution with clerical interests were not staggered. They produce accounts of evolution which make it just seem rather facile. An evolutionary progress simply towards human beings like ourselves. And that isn't quite what Darwin had been saying. But, and this is the caution, this is the caution, this is the nuance, this is the qualification. Within the scientific community in the second half of the 19th century, there was tremendous amount of unease about the Darwinian mechanism, not about the fact of evolution. That was now incontrovertible, but about the mechanism there were significant issues. Darwin himself, in his Descent of Man, freely admits that he gave too much weight to natural selection in the first edition of The Origin of Species. By the time you reach the 6th edition of The Origin, there are many, many qualifications. Darwin adopts some of the principles of Lamarck, whose theory of evolution is often sharply contrasted with that of Darwin. So the point I'm making here is that there was considerable disagreement among scientists themselves concerning the scope of natural selection. So we shouldn't be too hard on the churchmen who themselves don't always see the force of that Darwinian mechanism. Well, my last cautionary tale before briefly going to my last section. There is, I think, a caution necessary when we're discussing the question about the relations between science and the loss of a conventional religious faith. I think one has to say that the new perspectives in science that Darwin constructed certainly didn't help him to hang on to a religious faith. If you see the way Darwin saw the world, then that can itself be pushing you perhaps in the direction of skepticism. The process of natural selection can be read as a celebration of chance and contingency in the world, rather than intelligent design. The sheer volume of pain and suffering in the world, for Darwin told against a beneficent God, and yet it was what one would expect on the doctrine of natural selection. That's what he said many times. But here's the qualification, here's the nuance, here's the caution. It's not clear that the real triggers for Darwin's loss of faith were released by his science. If you read his account of his rejection of Christianity in his autobiography, you'll find there are 7 or 8 pages when he details all the considerations that had compelled him to renounce the faith of his earlier life. But science hardly appears. Above all, there's a moral revolt against a Christian doctrine which, as it was taught at the time, suggested that those who were outside the Christian fold were destined for eternal damnation. That's somebody who was destined for eternal damnation. It's Darwin's own father, Robert Darwin, the biggest man I ever saw, says Charles at one point. But in 1849, when Darwin's father died, the question of where he would spend eternity was a big issue. Because within the Darwin family, there had been a long tradition of religious dissent. His grandfather, Erasmus, another evolutionist, had been a free thinker. His father had once said, religion's okay if you're a woman. Or words to that effect. Darwin's brother, Erasmus, was an avowed atheist. These are his friends and family, destined for moral perdition in hell. It is, says Charles, a damnable doctrine. And that's the principal reason why he moves away from Christian teaching. But 2 years after his father died, tragedy struck when his young daughter Annie, at the tender age of 10, died. Over a period of several weeks she was ill. Charles had taken her to Malvern in Worcestershire, where his favourite doctor was to be found. Emma, his wife, stayed at home because she was expecting their next child. This means that we have a record of the correspondence that passed between Charles and Emma as Annie lay. You can read that correspondence yourself. It's in the life and, well, actually, no, it's in the correspondence of Charles Darwin, which Cambridge University Press is currently publishing in a multi-volume work. But I mention that because I would defy you to read those letters and not to weep. Deeply moving. And I think the view is that that was a critical moment in Darwin's own religious odyssey. How could a beneficent God allow such an innocent child to perish? It has been suggested, I think I've now learned, but this might be open to some doubt, but it has been suggested that it was after the death of Annie that Charles would take his family to church on a Sunday morning, but he would leave them at the church door and walk home. And that poignant image, I think, does give one some insight into the feelings and the convictions of a man who thought very deeply about religion, even though he often pretended not to. Well, just a few minutes now, if I may, on my last section. I want to call this Darwinism and the Death of God, because it's often implied that the Darwinian theory necessitates an atheistic conclusion. And I should just make it absolutely clear that Darwin did not take that view. He rejected Christian teaching, that is clear. He does not reject the notion that there is some ultimate creator on whom the whole universe, and that means the evolutionary processes within it, depend. I've never been an atheist, he writes to one of his correspondents. I've never been an atheist in the sense of denying the existence of God. In one of his later letters during the most agnostic phase of his life, he says it would be absurd to suggest that one cannot be an ardent theist and an evolutionist. That's Darwin himself speaking. So there are some very big questions about what the theory does and does not entail when we enter the metaphysical and the theological world. Philosophers sometimes say that the notion of God was not so much killed by some decisive event, as it being a case of death through 1,000 qualifications. The notion of a Godhead, can it be made coherent? And the argument sometimes is you can hold on to the concept, but you have to burden your defense with so many qualifications that in the end the notion, as it were, fades away. And I think one could say, if you take that sort of line, then Darwin's theory does add to that burden of qualifications. But we don't necessarily have to go along that route. What seems to have happened, I think, is that many religious thinkers who became sympathetic to the idea of evolution showed a willingness to readjust their image of God. And this was sometimes accompanied by the claim that Darwin had given them new religious insight. I want you to think about this, because that motif that Darwin had actually done religion a good turn surfaced in a lot of the religious literature of the late 19th century. Aubrey Moore, an Oxford theologian, famously said on one occasion, under the guise of a foe, Darwin has done the work of a friend. And what he meant was that Darwin had rescued Christianity from a kind of deistic travesty in which God had been presented as a kind of magician who intervened in the world waved a magic wand, and up came a hippopotamus. That sort of image of a divine conjurer seemed to many late 19th century commentators to be rather infantile. It's a terribly degrading image of a transcendent creator, to imagine that he dabbles in the world in the way that human beings dabble in their fish tanks, or whatever it may be. So the point I want to take and underline here is that there were images of God which took a real battering from these Darwinian debates. But to say that the image of God was changed is not the same as saying that the concept of God was destroyed. Now, these are the two images that I think took a battering. The first, God as a magician, as I've just indicated. The death of that God could actually be a cause for celebration. I'd just like to, actually, that's not Charles Kingsley, we better pass over that quickly. Charles Kingsley, in his novels, developed the notion that, putting it in a kind of aphoristic way, of old it was said that God was so wise he could make all things. Behold, he is now so much wiser. He can make all things make themselves. Interesting little quip there, indicating, in principle at least, a divine creator could work through the natural world, through the natural processes that such a God had, after all, instigated. Right, well, another image, the second one, that took a beating was, I think, the notion of God as a kind of artisan. It's another very anthropomorphic image. The image of God as a kind of engineer, a clockmaker, designing a wonderfully efficient universe. And most famously, William Paley had been an advocate of that image of the world, a static clockwork universe in which every part works together for the functioning of the whole. That little collage is just from one of the illustrated editions of Paley, showing a whole series of anatomical structures which spoke of the perfection of design in the world. Paley gives some remarkable examples of the perfection of these designs. The human epiglottis, he says, is so wonderfully designed that no alderman has ever choked at a feast. Well, perhaps some have, actually. And there are times when our drinks go down the wrong throat, as we put it. To dwell on the perfection of the designs was a traditional mode of religious apologia. After Darwin, you cannot, I think, pursue that argument so thoroughly. And those who today want to argue for intelligent design do need to remember that many of the designs we see in the world are not actually that good when you analyze them in terms of their function. There's a new book by Francisco Ayala called Darwin's Gift to Science and Religion. And it's a very interesting critique of intelligent design, stressing the fact that if you pin your religious hopes to that design argument, you may well be in trouble. So that was the second image that I wanted to stress. And I think Darwin does undermine that image simply by presenting natural selection as a perfecting mechanism in its own right. Or put it a slightly different way, natural selection can counterfeit design. So I would see Darwin as contributing to a move away from anthropomorphic images of the deity, but nevertheless allowing perhaps the notion of nature as a work of art. Let's forget about the artisan, but think perhaps more in terms of an artist. Now that's still anthropomorphic in various ways. But Darwin sees great beauty in nature. He talks about the beautiful contrivances by which orchids are fertilized. And that word contrivance is the very word that William Paley had used when talking about adaptations in nature. There is artistry in nature. Can I just give a plug for a wonderful exhibition that you can go to while you're here in Cambridge this week? It's in the Fitzwilliam Museum. It's called Endless Forms, Most Beautiful. And it's a wonderful experience just going around that exhibition. But it indicates ways in which, through Darwin's theory of sexual selection, some of the great beauty in nature could actually be explained. The markings on the tail of a peacock, or the markings on the feathers of the great Argus pheasant. And when Darwin talks about how those wonderful markings have actually developed through the processes of natural and sexual selection, he does not dispense with the language of artistry. And he even compares the patterns on the wing of the Argus pheasant with a painting by Raphael. It's very interesting. So do go to that exhibition, because you can see the wonderful interplay between the world of science and the world of art. And that's perhaps a rather nice point at which to stop, because I do strongly recommend you give yourself that delightful experience of looking at all the ways in which the universe after Darwin could still be presented in ways that evoked a sense of the beautiful and indeed the transcendent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for a great introduction to the week. Now we've got half an hour to discuss or raise any comments or questions that people have of John while he's here. Who wants to start?
In the second chapter of Genesis, when you got the story of Cain running off, and so the mark of Cain on him, so that other people won't kill him, there is almost a sense of another race other than that of Adam. I just wonder if that argument was ever involved in what we're talking about polygenesis, Genesis, whether
Well, it was, and of course we know that those who argued for slavery would often appeal to Scripture. So the story is not a simple one, and I think this is one of the real complications in that particular debate, that if you wished to argue for separate races, you could find many resources to support that position, and that particular scriptural narrative was one of them. Yes.
Yeah, I would recommend David Livingstone's recent book, Adam's Ancestors, which has chapters on that whole point. The way in which the Cain story was used by many theologians in the southern United States to justify slavery by presenting the black race as the descendants of Cain as cursed and inferior and not part of the human race. And in fact, going further to suggest that Cain may even have coupled with an animal rather than a human. I mean, the last chapters of David Livingstone's book, Adam's Ancestors, makes very grim reading, I must say, the way in which that's just to fill out your book.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
The theologians that saw Darwin's theory and the concept of natural selection as being actually a friend to the faith and not foe, I'd like to maybe know a little bit more about how they looked at such a bloody enterprise as natural selection as actually being a benefit to the Christian race, and how that would be superior to the artisan concept of God, which is he's a tinkerer there, but it's a lot cleaner and a lot less bloody.
That's a very good question. The key figure, I think, for exploring that question would be the Oxford theologian Aubrey Moore, whose name I mentioned very briefly. What's interesting about Moore is that he belonged to a group of theologians who at the time were re-emphasizing the immanence of God in creation. And they did that through stressing the doctrine of incarnation. So God is not simply the transcendent power above and beyond the universe, but God is present in the universe, sharing through the person of Christ and the cross, sharing human suffering, identifying with that suffering. And I think that's how the argument is worked out, that the fact that the evolutionary process is creating, that can hardly be denied. After all, when you look at the overall trajectory, that can hardly be denied. But I think there was that sense in which they wished to re-emphasize not the anthropomorphic image of the clockmaker, but a God who, through the incarnation, had identified with the world. And that makes a big difference, I think, to how you then construct the theology. So we're talking here about a re-emphasis on the doctrine of incarnation, and a language about divine participation in the world, not merely the transcendent creator, who could, of course, and if you adopt the old clockwork image, you could always say, and this was often said, if you present God that way, as simply the intelligent designer, then that view is compatible with a deistic view in which God winds the universe up but then has nothing more to do with it at all. And the critical point about the Christian revelation surely is that God does identify with the world and doesn't, as it were, lose that concern. A God who, on some constructions of modern theology, a God who suffers with the world and is actually changed. I know this is kind of heretical, but a God who is actually changed by the existence of human suffering. So one of the theological developments, which I didn't have time to talk about, would be that associated with Alfred North Whitehead, the American philosopher of the early 20th century, who went back to Plato and stressed the image of God as a kind of participant lure in creation, rather than the transcendent figure above and beyond. And the way Whitehead works it out has major implications for how you would talk about God's omnipotence. And I think perhaps one of the things one could say, if one were speaking theologically, is one of the Darwinian impacts is to force a rethinking about what you mean by omnipotence. Does that help at all? So, I mean, the answer, I think, is to look at a doctrine like incarnation, God's identification with the world, and an identification with human suffering.
Would you say then that some would say that natural selection actually presents a deistic perspective of God? Would you say then that people like Aubrey Moore would have endorsed a directed randomness, or would he or she have been an
It's
advocate?
a he.
An advocate of true undirected randomness. How would the randomness aspect be viewed, and also in a non-deistic context?
Right. Well, I think the way Aubrey Moore puts it is that Darwin has actually done the Christian religion a good turn, because it forces us to confront the question whether God is in everything or is in nothing. It sharpens the choice in a way. And of course he wanted to argue for the in everything rather than in nothing. That does, in my mind, raise a slight problem. The problem is that I don't think Darwin ever found it easy to think of God in everything. The reason is that he was very troubled by those features of the natural world which looked more devilish than benign. That ichneumon wasp that lays its eggs in the body of a caterpillar, and then when the eggs hatch, it's a pretty grisly, gruesome eventuality. There are features of the natural world which Darwin finds repulsive. What a book a devil's chaplain might write about the horribly cruel and wasteful works of nature, he writes somewhere. So I think what Darwin sees himself as doing, and this is interesting theologically, Darwin is unhappy with the idea that God is somehow immediately and directly responsible for those malevolent or seemingly malevolent features of creation. And indeed he says that in quite a lot of the correspondence towards the end of his life. In other words, one of the strengths of his naturalistic program, as he sees it, is that it somehow attenuates, it reduces the responsibility of God for those particular features of creation. If you accept a creationist position, let's use creationist in the sense of independent acts of creation. If you accept that paradigm, for Darwin it makes God directly responsible for that wasp. It makes God directly responsible for what he calls a whole train of vile molluscous animals. Whoops. That was nearly a disaster. So what he's saying is that once we accept an evolutionary process, we can see that incipient in the whole of creation were many, many possibilities. In a universe in which it's possible for human beings to emerge, it is also possible for that wasp to emerge. The structure, the physics, the chemistry of the universe make it possible for those other things to happen. But there's a sense in which you've slightly reduced God's immediate responsibility. So there are hints in Darwin himself of the possibility of a revised theodicy. And some later theologians do actually develop that theme. But I think that puts Darwin somewhat at odds with Aubrey Moore, even though Moore is wanting to claim that Darwin has done the Christian faith a good turn. But that's a deeply interesting question. Thank you for that.
Thank you. I think the next question.
I've got two questions. Since the Darwinists seem to have become advocates for human rights, contrary to Christian theologians, I was wondering if isn't there a missing link between seeming equality between all human beings, which is derived from this prototype human being, and dignity of all human beings, which Christianity before has already offered by saying that every human being is an image of God and has been created only according to the image of God. And the second, if Darwinians have some kind of theodicy saying that suffering is a collateral damage of progress, isn't that what Leibniz already said before, like in his theodicy as well, but with the difference that his Christian theodicy already offered a sense to all of this, while a randomized process doesn't necessarily have a sense, a direction, which is going to like a divine will to which everything aims. So is there anything really new that Darwinism offered that hasn't been said before by Christianity already?
No, that's a very interesting point, and I think that there are obvious similarities between the way I presented the argument a moment ago and the Leibnizian theodicy, where this is the best of all possible worlds. The Leibnizian argument is often misconstrued by putting the stress in the wrong place. We can make fun of it if we say it's the best of all possible worlds. It doesn't seem to be, but if you say the best of all possible worlds, then you get a rather different take on it. And I think to turn the Darwinian theory into a successful theodicy, you would have to be able to show that this is the only way in which human beings could have been made. Now, of course, we can't do that. That's the Kantian objection in part. I mean, how can you be sure you really have got all the possibilities lined up? So that construction of a theodicy is never going to have decisive apologetic import, I think. But yes, there certainly are resemblances between how you might construct a Darwinian theodicy and what Leibniz had been doing at the end of the 17th century. On your first question, that is very, very problematic. Of course, how you interpret the doctrine of our being made in the image of God. It's been interpreted so many ways. You could argue that even on the Darwinian account, it is only we who actually have reached that stage of self-consciousness, that we are aware that we carry a moral responsibility and the huge burden that entails, and indeed the curse as a consequence. And it's rather interesting, I was talking about this just this last week, but one of the great evolutionary biologists of the 20th century, Theo Dobzhansky, was actually a member of the Eastern, with the Russian Orthodox Church. And he gives a beautiful account of how the biblical symbol of the fall fits beautifully with the Darwinian sense of the development of human self-awareness and self-responsibility. So it all depends on how you develop the arguments. Darwin has been a resource for just about every possible theological and anti-theological position you could think of, just as Darwin has been a resource for just about every political and anti-political position you care to think of. And I think this is perhaps the value of historical work in some measure, that we cease to talk about influence as if there's some magic influence that spreads from Darwin to all these different thinkers, but to see Darwin as providing a resource that you can appropriate to justify all kinds of positions. I think historical analysis can help to give substance to that kind of approach.
Take one this question.
Yes, I was very interested in this discussion about Aubrey Moore, because it seems that Charles Kingsley's statement about how clever God have made things make themselves could actually be interpreted deistically too.
Sure.
Although many people don't, they interpret that in the same way as they interpret Aubrey Moore, I think, as God being immanent within the processes. So, and I think you make a statement, something along these lines, one brief comment in your book about this, but could you say a bit more about that?
It is an interesting issue. If we just go for a moment to the intelligent design question, Kenneth Miller, who I think has written one of the best ripostes to Michael Behe and Bill Dembski, he has actually argued very clearly that the image of God that Darwin himself presents is in many ways the solution to the theological problem. And the way Ken Miller describes God's relationship to the world does to a lot of people sound deistic. But from his point of view, it's a perfectly acceptable Catholic position. And the best, or much of the best, Catholic theology in the past has underlined God's sustenance of the world, but not the idea of a God who's forever fiddling around with the natural world. So there is a sense in which the deistic God, when placed within a larger Christian framework, can be an acceptable position. I think Karl Rahner and others have stressed, here are all these Protestants talking away about how God fiddles with the quantum level and is messing about with the world that he's made. But it's in some ways a rather debilitating image of a God whose role in the world shouldn't be trivialized. So yes, I think the Charles Kingsley phrase, if you just take it in isolation, could be read as a deistic model. But that argument that God is so much wiser he can make all things make themselves, a very similar argument was actually used by Isaac Newton in the 17th century. The fact that you could now give a mechanistic account of how the solar system worked, for Newton, did not detract at all from God's power. It actually showed that God was a mathematician every bit as brilliant as Newton himself. that there is this kind of brilliant calculation that's done to set the whole thing up, and then it works for the most part. It works. There are slight problems in the Newtonian cosmos. So yes, we do need to be very careful about this. I would say that if we're going to introduce this word deism, which is itself deeply ambiguous. In the early 18th century, there were tracts showing 4 or 5 different meanings of deism. But let's say that what we should understand by deism is a rejection of propositions deduced from revelation that cannot be independently corroborated through reason. In other words, deism is not primarily the position that there is the clockmaker who has nothing more to do with the world. It's basically a thesis about revelation and the authenticity of revelation and how you validate the authenticity of revelation with rational argument of one kind or another. I think perhaps that, and I don't know whether that is helpful, but the image of the God so wise that he can establish the initial parameters, that need not be deistic. It depends how you place it in the wider framework.
Thank you.
Yes.
You mentioned that Wallace and Darwin argued about the evolution of the human mind. What were the arguments that were put forward, and how did that work itself out? I mean, now I guess we go along a Darwinian view, although I saw in a recent report of Nature that there was a comment that maybe culture is involved in the evolution of the human mind. I don't know what you
hugely
think
involved, I would have thought. Yes. How the argument went in the 19th century, if we just take Wallace's stance for a moment, he argued that there are certain features of the human mind, particularly our mathematical ability, our appreciation of beauty, our appreciation of music, and other aesthetic sensibilities, which could not be said in themselves to be useful in a struggle for survival. Nor are these particular characteristics universally distributed across humankind. And so Wallace is suggesting that a theory that stresses the survival value of those characteristics which are transmitted and repeatedly transmitted from generation to generation, if the survival value of those is in doubt, then you're probably going to need some other kind of explanation for their development. Well, we've come a very, very long way from those days. We are now recognizing, for example, that Darwin himself might have had a very valuable insight when seeing in birdsong the origins of language. It's a very interesting argument which has recently been resuscitated. But that was the state of affairs in, shall we say, the 1870s. And Wallace was so convinced that natural selection could not account for these kind of attributes that he's willing to entertain the notion of a spiritual force in some sense guiding the process of evolution. And his arguments along those lines are very interesting. But because he got enthralled by spiritualism, his reputation began to be tarnished within the scientific community of that time. And one might argue that his reputation has suffered as a consequence thereafter. We always pick out Darwin as the symbol of evolution. Very rarely does Wallace get a mention. Even though the way he had constructed the theory when he was out in Malaysia is very, very similar to the Darwinian model. So similar, of course, that Darwin was absolutely devastated when he saw a copy of Wallace's paper. Wallace had sent to Darwin a copy of a paper asking Darwin to comment, in the way academics do. If you've got the odd half hour, cast your eye over this. Just let me know if I'm along the right tracks. Darwin reads it over breakfast one day, and is absolutely shattered. Every paragraph in Wallace's paper, he writes to Lyell, is a chapter in my book. In other words, there is a homology between the two theories, and he is therefore in serious danger of losing the priority. Sorry, I've digressed a bit.
So how did Darwin answer Wallace?
On the question of these
Of art
particular
and music and these sorts of things.
capacities, well, I think he would turn to his concept of sexual selection, which Wallace was very unhappy with. So Darwin would say there are many characteristics of humans, and indeed other animals, which we can explain if we see them associated with behaviour patterns in the male of the species which renders the male more attractive to the female. Those of you who are feminists in the audience may be interested to know that Darwin does make the female the arbiter here. It's the female who chooses the mate in that sense. And so you get developments in all species to reflect that. The human being, of course, is rather different because on the whole, it's the female that ornaments herself in order to make her more attractive to the male. But the debate at the time was particularly interesting because the way females were ornamenting themselves was by taking the feathers of birds of paradise, of pheasants, of peacocks, all these things, and sticking them in their hats. So, it makes a nice little story. But you can learn more about that at the Fitzwilliam Museum exhibition, which I was plugging earlier. It's an absolute delight. Everybody's written rave reviews of it, so you will find it really worth the trip. And it's free.
Should we take one last question? Yes.
If I may, thank you very much for a fantastic talk. And it struck me, there are a lot of parallels to the Galileo experience. I haven't been to a talk that actually talked about that, but anyway, one or two I just wanted to raise a question. The first one is the whole Huxley-Wilberforce debate. I think most scientists aren't that concerned about who said what, simply because, apart from the fact that the records are probably unreliable, science isn't like the law. It doesn't really matter who is the best advocate on the day, as you know, so it's kind of a side issue. But what we most enjoy is the writings of Huxley are more surely about, they set Darwinism in context, the whole idea of the rise of the experimental method and the time of Michael Faraday and John Tyndall. It wasn't just Darwin, that all these people were beginning to argue that science should speak for itself, or I should say should be allowed to speak for itself without influence from anybody, never mind, not just religion, philosophy also, that they felt the facts should be allowed to speak for themselves. It wasn't that was really the point Huxley was trying to make. But my question is this, what always puzzled me about, I understand Huxley's side of the argument, I don't understand the reception to Darwinism of say, people like Wilberforce, because it seems to me the wait-and-see approach was the lesson that they should have learned from the Galileo experience, that they should have waited, because this was, after all, the experimental method had only just really arrived, and this was a very radical theory by any standards, and it had yet really to be accepted by mainstream science. I mean, it hadn't yet, even though, of course, I think Wallace's work did contribute a lot to its acceptance, because it wasn't just one person, but I think, you know, you already had a very sort of large public interest from both a religious and philosophical point of view, from both experts and all sorts of amateurs, on a theory which had yet to enter the mainstream. And the problem with that is a lot of the counter-arguments that are made were later shown to be wrong as the science developed, as you know, and that's what I don't understand, that in a sense, when I say a parallel to Galileo, it really was like that, you know, that they were attacking something which wasn't yet the mainstream. Or how
There's a lot one could say to that. Just about everything you've said, I would actually agree with, so I'm not going to have a dispute over what you said. But with reference to the Galileo affair, and Erland can correct me if I get this wrong, but there is interesting research done fairly recent on Vatican reactions to the Darwinian theory. And it seems that quite a number of Catholic biologists who were interested in evolution and were suggesting modes of rapprochement were behind the scenes quietly rebuked by the elders within the Catholic Church, told, in other words, to shut up, putting it mildly, and yet there was no public condemnation of Darwinism in the way that there had been of the Galileo case. So the argument could very well be there that the Church had learned as a consequence of that. It was deeply unhappy with various aspects of the Darwinian theory, but it was not going to make a great big public pronouncement. So sometimes one hears the argument that the Catholic Church was more sympathetic to the Darwinian theory than many of the Protestant churches, but I think this latest research puts at least a question mark over that there were serious concerns about the nature of the human soul, the special place that humankind has in creation. The other aspect of your question was, you know, why did somebody like Wilberforce go on the offensive? And it's a good question, because in retrospect one can see that he arguably made quite a basic mistake, having nothing to do with the Galileo affair per se. But the mistake he made was to assume that because we are descended or derived from other primate forms, we do not have any unique characteristics of our own. For Wilberforce, it is almost as if this continuity between the animals and human beings does completely overthrow the special place of humankind in God's eyes. And where he does theologize in his review of the origin, he does stress, man is the person, humanity is the species, if you know, for whom God sacrificed his son for our redemption. And for Wilberforce, that puts a curtain between humanity on the one hand and the rest of the animal creation on the other. But as for his philosophical objections to the origin, this actually also introduces a very interesting theme which we haven't time to explore. But you were pointing out that the experimental method is still relatively young if you're taking a broad perspective on it. But what is fascinating is that inductive experimental method associated with Francis Bacon in the 17th century had in English scientific culture, popular scientific culture anyway, become the kind of sacrosanct standard by which any scientific work was judged. Now the problem is this: during the early years of the 19th century, actually, new scientific methods are introduced, what we would call hypothetico-deductive approaches. The atomic theory in chemistry is a very good example, because you're postulating things that you can't see. So Dalton's atomic theory would be a good example. Contemporary with Darwin, the kinetic theory of gases would be a very interesting example. You construct the model and then show that deductions from the model square with the data. But it's not primarily an inductive procedure from the data to the theory. Now, Darwin is often presented as a perfect exemplar of an inductive method. That's completely false. I mean, he of course collected data, and the data were deeply suggestive. But Darwin's theory is successful because it illustrates what William Whewell called a consilience of inductions. It fits the data in many different domains of application. And Darwin refers to natural selection as a hypothesis. On my hypothesis of natural selection, he keeps saying, if you believed that science should be done the Baconian way, then Darwin's postulation of natural selection as a hypothesis to explain this great diversity of natural history data, that is violating a sacrosanct method. And that's the line that Wilberforce takes in his review. It's too speculative, it's too hypothetical, given what we know now. It's more programmatic than it is a complete representation of nature. But what has happened since, of course, is that programmatic approach to nature has been substantiated by almost every piece of empirical research. So the jigsaw, is being completed all the time. And with the DNA sequencing, the argument for evolution, I would have thought, now is utterly